Well, hello, everyone. As usual, it is just so wonderful to be here on this. It's a beautiful day here in Queens. I hope it's beautiful inside or outside, wherever you are. What I'd like to do is the opening liturgy for the sutra, which is the unsurpassed and profound and sublime Dharma is difficult to encounter even in a billion eons. Today we receive, hear, and uphold it, vowing to fathom the true meaning of the Tathagata. Okay, so today we will be covering quite a bit of territory. And as Kenny said, I'll be talking about the Lotus Sutra kind of in the background, but about studying and practice and a number of concerns that we have as practitioners. To get the ball rolling, I'm going to tell a few stories before I get into the heart of my talk. The first one, some of you may have heard this, is about a Zen master who mounts the podium in the Chan Hall and is about to give a Dharma talk. And he lifts the whisk, the whisk, which is to whisk away the cobwebs in our mind. He lifts the whisk, and just as he's about to speak, a bird starts twittering away, singing beautifully. So he holds the whisk while the bird is talking, while the bird is singing. And the bird continues to sing, and at some point, after a certain amount of time, the bird stops, the master puts the whisk down, and then walks out of the Dharma hall. So the question is, did he give a Dharma talk? Did he forget what he wanted to say and he walked out? He took advantage of this. So I'm just setting this up. There's really no answer to something like this, but what this is a wordless teaching, if you will. And we're going to explore the use of words and how we depend on them, how we transcend them, how we misinterpret them, a whole bunch of things. So here's another story. This is a joke my father told me many years ago. And this concerns an actor who is retired and lives in New York City. He gets a call from his agent, and his agent says, I have a gig for you can't refuse. We'll pay you $5,000 for 1 day's work. All you have to do is you get flown to LA, you go on to the Hollywood stage, and you have one line, which is hark, hark, the cannons roar. So obviously this retired actor can't turn this down, and he starts thinking to himself, hark, hark, the cannons roar. Cannons roar, hark, hark, the cannons roar. So, and notice I could make this joke last forever, but I won't. So he gets a cab to the airport. He flies from JFK to LA, all the time saying, hark, hark, the cannons roar. Hark, hark, the cannons roar. And the cab picks him up at the airport, takes him onto the stage. He walks in and he hears boom, boom. And he says, what the hell is going on here? So this joke, I always thought that this was a symbol of somebody who lacked mindfulness, right? He's been rehearsing this line, right? And then he hears the sound of cannons, one presumes, and instead of drawing on the experience of this thing that he's been talking about and going over in his mind, he says something else. But there's another interpretation of it, which I just got from my partner this morning. What if he really was mindful? And now he's responding in the moment. He's let go of this thing that was running in his mind. And he just says, what's going on here, right? Kind of appropriate, right? So I'm just showing how we have ways of judging. We see things in many different ways. Another story at a Chan center I used to go to, there was someone who came, and this person really didn't meditate. And when I asked him about it, he said, what I do is I take walks in the woods. That's my meditation. Now, some of us who are very invested in practice might say, well, that's not really meditation. I mean, he's not studying anything. He's not sitting and getting knee pains. So, pa. But who are we to say that? How do we know, right? How do we know what's really going on in someone's mind? So there's a story from Zhuangzi of Zhuangzi and another philosopher who are standing on a bridge on the river Hao. And Zhuangzi looks down the river and says, "Look at the fish, my, how they're enjoying themselves." And the friend says to him, "You're not a fish. How do you know they're enjoying themselves?" And Zhuangzi looks at him and says, "You're not me. How do you know that I don't know that they're enjoying themselves?" Right? So we get caught up in all these things. So now I want to launch more into my formal talk. Welcome everyone formally, and talk about the topic, which is practice, whatever we mean by practice and whatever we mean by study. And depending on how time works, I'll get into that in more detail. But I know many of you have listened to me over, well, perhaps 3 years, as I've gone through every chapter of the Lotus Sutra, and I've done the preceding sutra, the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, and the succeeding sutra, which is the Sutra of the Practices of Universal Sage, or Samantabhadra. And so you might think that, okay, I've done, been there, done that, but not really, because I'm always reminded of the great Japanese master Hakuin, who lived in the 18th century. And when he was 16 years old, he read the Lotus Sutra, and he said, "What's the big deal? It's kind of dumb, just all these stories. I don't get it." And then 16 years later, he's 32 years old, and he wrote, "One night after some time, I took up the Lotus Sutra. Suddenly, I penetrated to the perfect, true, ultimate meaning of the lotus. The doubts I held initially were destroyed, and I became aware of the understanding that I obtained had been in error. Unconsciously, I uttered a great cry and burst into tears." So I haven't quite burst into tears yet, not having gotten to that level, but I see the road in front of me. And one thing that I've gotten from all of my talks on the Lotus Sutra is how rich and how deeply fathomable it can be. So, and I will talk about the Lotus here and there. And one thing that I really want to emphasize in terms of recommending the Lotus Sutra, if you will, is the sutra's ultimate inclusivity. Everybody is contained in the Lotus Sutra, from little bitty creatures to great gods. There's no one is left out. And that's, to me, one of the wonderful messages of Buddha Dharma in general. So the areas that I'm going to talk about cover how we practice, how we work with our vexations, how we approach the sutras and the works of the great masters. So in being in the moment, we can see what kind of constraints hold on to us. For us, we think about the past, we think about the future, we give very little to the present. And so what we're normally dealing with is our expectations about the future and our disappointments about the past, or our recollections. And so the actual present moment can kind of escape us. So one complaint that is often lodged against the Lotus Sutra is that it doesn't tell us, give us a really specific teaching. The Lotus Sutra is famous for not giving a teaching in a way, although, as I've argued in the past, the whole sutra is a teaching. It's just accessible in a very different way because of the 5 practices, right, of embracing, reading, reciting, copying, and teaching. That's the practice. That's the doctrine of the Lotus Sutra. And it doesn't really sound like a doctrine, right? So when we hear a phrase like from the Diamond Sutra, that says, dwell nowhere and this mind will arise. Now, that's something we can sink our teeth into, even though we don't really understand it. The mind, in this case, is meant to be the mind of enlightenment. And when we use a phrase like that, we don't really know what it means. And it's because where we're dwelling is in our fears, our desires, Netflix, Cinnabons, and just general malaise. The Heart Sutra tells us that everything is empty and emptiness is everything. It's much more nuanced than that. You can't sum up the Heart Sutra in just a quick sentence, but there seems to be an elusive thread that you can hold on. The Sutra of Complete Enlightenment speaks about illusion and reality, developing deep mind states and deep levels of concentration, as well as ending all attachments. The Lankavatara delves into the levels of consciousness and how we attach to the projections of our mind. The Vimalakirti Sutra shows the emptiness of all things and even the undefinability of non-dualism, but also, much like the Lotus, destroys our sense of reality by matter-of-factly positing inconceivable occurrences, like bodhisattvas who can shrink whole galaxies to the size of a grain of sand and then restore them to their original size without the inhabitants knowing anything happened. And of course, in the Lotus Sutra, all of the teachings that we do recognize from early Buddhism are there. The Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, dependent origination, the five skandhas, and even non-dualism, and even some very esoteric practices, but they're just messaged, they're just given in passing, if you will. So you'd think that as the king of sutras, that's what the Lotus Sutra is called, there would be a very firm position about what practice is and what its goals should be. So, I've often talked about Dao Sheng, one of the first commentators on the Lotus, who talked about Li, this principle, the thing that's going on with the Lotus Sutra that is pervasive everywhere within the sutra, within us, but it's not definable and not graspable by our normal means. So, in some ways, as I was preparing this talk, I felt like I painted myself into a corner. But that's good. I can enjoy the corner, right? And so, if I'm going to try to communicate a message that cannot really be contained in words, it's going to be an interesting effort. But in terms of what our lives are, ordinary lives, and let's, this is why we're all here, I think, is because of our ordinary lives. I mean, I will be getting into some fairly esoteric things, but if you think about what our lives are, the places we go, things we buy or produce, people we interact with, they have names and labels, and it's often the names and labels and not the people and the places and things that we interact with. We interact with things in our minds. So, and what we actually interact with in a given moment, I mean, wherever you are sitting right now, if you attempted to put into words everything that's going on, everything that you're feeling now, everything that you see, hear, experience in your body, utterly impossible. But when you ask people how you're doing, they say fine, as if that really covers what's going on. And the stories that we tell ourselves are just like that, stories. So I just, this is a line from one of Bob Dylan's songs. It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. It says, advertising signs, they con you into thinking you're the one that can do what's never been done, that can win what's never been won. Meantime, life goes on all around you, right? And seeing what is going on all around us and inside us is quite an undertaking. I mean, it would seem, I often quote George Orwell, the English author, who said, the most difficult thing in the world is to see what's right under your nose. And so that's what we're talking about. So if we look at the story making that we use to define ourselves, in terms of being a good person, a bad person, a successful person, a mediocre person, bright, dumb. All of these labels, they're not making us any happier. So this is a lot of what I see Buddha Dharma is about, is cutting through this, cutting through the perceptions that make us feel this way and the way that we express this to ourselves and to other people. So what I'm really looking at here is, how we understand and retain what we read and hear. And the thing that I guess sort of bothers me about my own practice in reading sutras and listening to Dharma talks is regarding them as like a novel or a story. I read this, I read the Surangama Sutra, I read it, right? It's like there was a comedian who talked about Tolstoy's War and Peace and said, I read it, it's about Russia. Well, that certainly tells you a lot, right? So the thing is, we're constantly in the moment. The sutra is constantly telling us what's there. And, we listen, we don't listen. We go in a lot of different ways. So with that introduction, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about a particular teaching and incident that happened in the Ming Dynasty. And I'm going to get into some things which are fairly intellectual, and I will try and make them as accessible as possible, right? But I'm going to share my screen just so I want to, let's see, okay. All right. So I just wanted, so this is, much as I've said not to read sutras and everything is like a cast of characters or a play, well, here are all the people that are contained in this story. So there's first, and actually the most important, if you will, is Han Yue Fazan, right? He's the Ming Dynasty, lived in the 16th and 17th century. There's Mi Yan Wu, who was his teacher at one point. Zebo Zhangke, another Ming Dynasty scholar who commented on some of the works that were written by Juefan Huihong. Now, this is Sung Dynasty, right? 1071 to 1128. And there are also two masters from the Tang of Guifeng Zhongmi and Linji. I just have his, one part of his title there. So look at all the years that are there. And I'm showing these because as I go back and forth, it could be sort of confusing. And like I said, I will go very slowly and show you what I'm talking about. So in order to introduce this, I want to talk about the uncertainty of words in practice. I want to ease everyone down into this material I'm going to do. So, this is really about Master Han Yue's attitude towards sutra teachings, right? And this was an article by a contemporary scholar named Yishun Huang. And so a lot of what we're talking about revolves around what it means to teach Chan. And anytime we hear about something like that, I think we're also hearing about what it's like for us to be taught. What are we going to listen to? What's important to us? What seems to connect to us? What seems not to connect to us? Now, at the heart of this article is this kind of contradiction we find in Chan. We look at Bodhidharma's 4 axioms, right? A transmission outside of Dharma, not dependent on words or language or concepts or labels or categories, which directly points to the mind, wherever the mind is, everywhere, seeing one's nature in order to realize Buddhahood. So this, many of us have heard this many, many times. And it's not like I think we understand that so fully. if we look at it just on the surface, it's a little hard to process. For one thing, these are instructions, but they dodge the fact that they are instructions, right? So they are dependent on words and language. You have to read them to know that you're not supposed to read them, right? They might be outside of scripture, but over the centuries, these four axioms in Chan have almost become scripture. They've been very important, often quoted. So does that mean they're contradictory, right? Is Bodhidharma really telling us something and not meaning it? And I don't really think that's the case. So if you remember from the poem Faith and Mind, it says, if you wish to enter the one vehicle, and I'm taking that as a plug for the Lotus Sutra, right? In other words, into the world of true enlightenment of one mind. If you wish to enter the one vehicle, do not be repelled by the sense realm. With no aversion to the sense realm, you become one with true enlightenment. So by extension, it sort of means that you can use the sense realm, right? And in the Sutra of the Method of Contemplating Universal Sage, Santibhadra, there's Ananda, Maitreya, and Mahakashapa, and they ask the Buddha a number of questions. This is what they want to get to help them with their practice of remorse and repentance and acknowledgement. So the last two are very relevant for this discussion. So they ask the Buddha how, without cutting off their delusions and renouncing their 5 desires, can aspiring bodhisattvas purify their sense faculties and completely eliminate the accumulated karma of their wrongs. With only the pure Dharma eyes received at birth from their parents, and without forsaking their 5 desires, how can they see things unaffected by their impediments? So in a sense, it's asking, how can we remain just as we are in the world with everybody we know, but somehow not be caught up in our attachments? That's kind of, and this is, I think, is a really a good understanding of the pursuit of Chan, you know, to be fully here, but not in a way that is going to sway our judgment and make us act in ways that are not wholesome. And what was talked about here is actually even deeper than language. It goes right to the 5 skandhas, which are often described as illusory and defiled. You know, there's that whole thing about, you know, seeing is believing, and quoted this more recently. Alan Watts said that the way things really work for us is believing isn't seeing. We see what we want, we don't see what we don't want. There's, once again, there's no rejection of words and language, but a warning not to depend on them. I'm reminded from the Tao Te Ching, where Lao Tzu says, those who speak do not know, and those who know do not speak, right? And Bo Jui, Tang Dynasty poet, said, Master Lao said, those who know don't speak, those who speak don't know. And it took him 5,000 characters to say that, right? So there's always these contradictions. So in keeping with the sensibility of the Lotus Sutra, we'll really recognize that not everybody is the same in terms of their capacity, their interest, the amount that they're willing to persevere. It's all different. So it says in the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, and certainly in chapter 5 of the Lotus Sutra, the meaning will always be the same, but the understanding will be different according to people's capacity. And I'm going to give a good example of that towards the end of the talk. So there are people who can maintain a very strict practice and that will remain far from defiling forms and concepts. But there are people who are in very different situations. And also in the spirit of the Lotus Sutra, nobody is left out. So, all right, so I just thought this would be, I'm going to share the screen. And let me go over here to share screen. All right, so this is really, I think everyone can see these two characters, right? All right, I was thinking just before I gave the talk, because always trying to adapt things to our culture. So people who grow up here and watch Sesame Street will know that Sesame Street episodes often begin by saying, today's episode is brought to you by the number 9 and the letter A, or the letter 8 and they go through the whole thing. So today's episode is brought to you by these two characters, Jur and Jung, and they figure into what I'm talking about. So Jur, the character on the left, is the character that is used for wisdom. It's not the only one. And once again, one could speak all day to define wisdom. And I'm just going with wisdom is the state of not being caught up in self and seeing the world clearly. Once again, without going too far. Also want to show the etymology of the character, which is interesting. The top, which shows an arrow and coming in a mouth, which is just the normal word of knowing, our ordinary way of knowing. The bottom character, the box with the line through it, is the word for mouth. So wisdom has this sense of being very dynamic, of coming in, coming out, being very much attached to the relative and the absolute. The character to the right, Jung, also, now once again, I'm taking some liberties with this, but I don't know how people who actually speak Chinese are going to react to this, but I can get away with anything with someone who doesn't know, right? So the lines and the little box on the left is the character for or the radical for words or speech, and the one on the right is the character for to climb. So my image of it is like you're climbing out of words, so that's why it can mean realization or transformation or enlightenment. And in contemporary Chinese, it's often mean just to prove something. It's just a word for proving. So I have there the Zhejiang controversy. I'm going to stop this share for a second. So I showed you, I mean, it's not like anyone's going to remember those names I flashed on the screen, but we're starting with Juefan Huihong in the Sung Dynasty. So he was an influential Chan master of the Sung Dynasty, and he coined the term literary Chan, Wenzi Chan, right? To emphasize learning Chan through written words. He found that he needed an intellectual approach to Chan because he had many students who were Confucian literati, really great intellectuals who were steeped in the Confucian classics and used to very intensive study. So in order to teach them, he wanted Chan to reach out to them and talk to them on the level that they understood. So, and I just want to point out that today in America, we're faced with a similar task, if you will, because Buddhism, I mean, Buddhism has been flourishing in America since the 50s, perhaps, really. It's been around for 70 years, but it's not mainstream culture at this point. So we who will teach are always trying to figure out ways of reaching people. And certainly as a teacher, one wants to know are you presenting something that is going to be true and the correct teaching? Are you misleading people? There are lots of questions. They're very important. So Huihong wrote the Zhejiang Zhuan, right? So those two characters, Zhejiang Zhuan, and which is sometimes translated as a commentary on wisdom and enlightenment, or the realization of wisdom, whatever it is. And he used sutra teachings and his commentary, not unlike some of the Gungan collections that we often use in Chan. And he made a very good case for the role of sutras in Chan training. Now, some 400 years later, right, in the Ming Dynasty, Han Yue Fazong, right, who lived in the 16th and 17th century, he wrote a commentary to Wei Hong's work called Guiding Words to the Zhezhong. And he taught this work at his monastery almost to the day he died. But he received some serious pushback from his master Mi Yun. So right now, I just want to put on the table what this controversy is, right? Here it is, you know, we heard Bodhidharma's words about not getting caught up in scripture and words, and we're trying to understand what that means. And here we have some great masters who are nonetheless emphasizing sutra study, emphasizing teachings, and seeing that as a part of true Chan practice. So Master Han Yue had a very interesting journey to his position. At age 40, he entered a 100-day silent and solitary death retreat. It's called Buyu Tsuguan. I don't know if that's a very common term, but you know, no words, going to the gate of death, right? That's the kind of retreat. And he finally obtained enlightenment without a master's guidance. And I don't know how often that happens, but I think it's rather rare. You know, he just said, hey, I'm enlightened. Probably more complicated than that. Okay, so now there's another Ming master named Zobua Zhengke, a little older than Han Yue, who also considered Hui Hong, right, this Song Dynasty master, to be a true disciple of Lin Ji. And there's just an ancillary accompanying story to this, which is interesting, which I'm just putting out. So, certainly nothing I'm going to address in detail, but there is this really interesting phenomenon in Chan about lineage and about schools of thought, schools of practice. And it's often very important for a teacher to get transmission from master. And I know I work as a docent in the Rubin Museum, where we have many tankas and paintings of great Buddhist teachers and deities. And often across the top, there are all the lineage holders sort of looking down and approving what a teacher is doing. So making a statement like, Hui Hong, right, living in the 1100s, is really a disciple of Lin Ji, living in the 800s. Interesting how people's minds think. So now, so Han Yue, 400 years past Hui Hong, considered himself to be Hui Hong's disciple. So just to show, Hui Hong thinks he's a disciple of Lin Ji, and Han Yue thinks he's a disciple of Hui Hong. Right, Hui Hong. Vast wisdom, that's what Hui Hong's name means. So, and he tried for many years to master and confirm his enlightenment. And then Han Yue claimed to be his Dharma heir. And so this phenomenon, interestingly enough, is called transmission by remote succession, Yao Se in Chinese. So, and that's when a monk declares himself the master's legitimate Dharma heir without meeting the master in person. And I just think that that in and of itself is an interesting thing to contemplate, just what that means, why he did it, what the implications are. So, so now the author, Shun Yi Huang, that's a person living now, or who wrote this article about these masters. He's curious to know, why did these masters include sutra study when Chan is not supposed to have sutra study? So he researched the name Zhezhong. How did Hui Hong come up with this? And in the interim, he read what Hui Hong said. And here's another theme that often happens, and I think it's important to make note of this, of how teachers are dissatisfied with the teaching in their times. So Hui Hong wrote that Chan practitioners seek madly and are afflicted by dishonesty. This is because they cannot refine themselves with wise intellection. And he meant learning the sutras, reading. And everybody is free to make their own, have their own opinion about the usefulness of this. And Hui Hong also wrote, Chan practitioners cannot employ the power of wisdom to refute and eliminate ignorance. And if they can't do that, they'll remain frantic for the rest of their lives. And so here's the thing that Hui Hong thought, that he thought the teaching of the Vimalakirti Sutra shows that wisdom can be attained by understanding the meaning of emptiness through any sound or form. So this wisdom also cures Chan practitioners' mad seeking and tendencies towards dishonesty, so they can rest their minds and achieve freedom. So now we go to the first thing, which I'm going to put on the screen again. Let's see. Okay, I hope, is this readable? Is it big enough? Okay, so I thought this was fascinating. Now, I don't know if other people are going to share my fascination, but this was Hui Hong's. Now, just to be very clear on it, the thing seems to be that Hui Hong never said why he called his collection Zhezheng. And so this scholar today is trying to figure out, and he found this line right from the Vimalakirti Sutra. So I'm reading the translation from, let me see if I can move this over. This is from Gordon McRae. The forms you see are equivalent to what the blind see. The sounds you hear are equivalent to echoes. The fragrances you smell are equivalent to wind. The flavors you eat should not be discriminated. Your tactile sensations are like the realization, and you should understand that the dharmas are like phantasms. This is said by Vimalakirti to Mahakashapa when he is begging. And Vimalakirti is looking, I guess he can look into Mahakashapa's mind and sees that he's holding on to desire and fear as he's going along begging. So he's calling him out on that and basically saying that he's getting caught in the 5 skandhas, right? Now, I also put the last line is Burton Watson, accept all sensations in accordance with the enlightenment of wisdom and understand that all phenomena are no more than phantom forms. The reason I disagree with this translation, and I'm curious if anyone has an opinion, because it didn't make sense to me to say that what you see is, it's like you're blind. What you hear is just echo. You're not really hearing it. What you smell is just the wind. There's no real smell there. The flavors you eat are all the same. And then all of a sudden, tactile sensations are like the realizations of wisdom. And now I'm once again probably making a stretch here, but I took the word, there's a word touch here, which I sort of said that, or I feel that everything that you're encountering as it's encountered is real. It's what we add to things. It's not like everything going on here is just a phantasm. It's just, we're all just made of puffs of smoke. Well, there may be some truth to that ultimately, but what things are actually happening. What the question is for practitioners is that we hold on to these things. Like right now, your mind could be listening, you could be having all sorts of opinions, you could be distracted, right? I know on Zoom you can do your laundry, right, while you listen to a Zoom talk, right? So the question is where you are. So this is that's why Hui Hong that's why it's thought that that's why he named this. So then we get to another opinion. Right. Let me go down here a little. So here is Zebo, which is purple cypress tree, just in case. Right. You know, people who don't know Chinese, the names are hard to grasp. So what he says that he's talking about the title of the text is Zhezheng, meaning that without wisdom, one is not able to distinguish right from wrong. Without enlightenment, one is not able to carry out reward and punishment. Only when one has both wisdom and enlightenment is one able to represent the great Dharma. And then writing about Hui Hong, he hopes that as long as there is one person in the world who had a chance to read this text, understand the principle, and carry out the patriarch's teachings, he did not write it in vain. So let me stop the share then. There we go. So to lay out this in simpler terms, we have these two words, wisdom and realization. One master, and I am twisting this a little bit, but for the sake of argument, one master sees kind of the emptiness there, and the wisdom comes from this contemplation of the emptiness of forms, which I don't think is necessarily incorrect. But the other master is looking at the wisdom as being something that will work in the world. When they use reward and punishment, they're talking about how a Chan master would work with a disciple. I mean, you know, once again, in Chinese, they use awfully stark terms, you know, like punishment sounds like, which sometimes happens, but it's really about giving some approval or steering a student in the right direction or stopping a student from being in the wrong direction. So I think this, for me, this kind of controversy set the tone for looking at how we understand how we're using the sutras. Are we getting caught up in the words? Are we puffing ourselves up because I know so many sutras and I can quote them or whatever? Or are we thinking that the sutras, there is a Zen saying where sutras are demon speak, you know, they're really just getting me off the path, and I'm not going to have anything to do with them. So, you know, so that's what Zebo's understanding is. And let me see, you know, I was looking at, oh, okay, my time is good. So it's also interesting to know that that when Han Yue was looking at this collection, he used this term called, you know, getting rid of arrow roots and vines, getung in Chinese, to refer to the Zhezheng Zhuan. And so there's a comparison with the Gateless Gate, Master Wumen's work, where in this gate, in that work, Master Wumen is saying that he's using bricks to knock on the door of the gateless barrier. And, you know, what are those bricks? You know, how do you crash open a gate that doesn't exist? In a sense, is the question he's asking. And so Han Yue was really, seemed to have been a really great teacher at the time. One of his followers said that listening to him, and he taught at Shengshou Se, was like the Buddha's teaching of the Lotus Sutra before he entered nirvana. So I want to get in more plugs for the Lotus Sutra. And so he said that the Han Yue raised, this is Zebo, these questions, and his guiding words were the essential Xin Yao of the Chan Patriarch's teachings. So, and once again, like Hui Hong, Han Yue was able to get many disciples from the Confucian literati. And I guess in a religion's growth and the spreading of the Dharma. It's important to be able to reach all walks of life. And so Hui Hong and Huan Yu's attitudes may differ. And so Hui Hong agrees that the sutra teachings have the same effect as Chan, but Han Yu considered sutra teachings to be a necessary expedient for some people. You know, just like the Lotus Sutra would say, these things work for some people and don't work for others. And and then this is sort of a sidelight, but I think it's very interesting. So Han Yu had a very critical attitude towards some other teachings. And I think this is very interesting to notice when we look at teachers and their attitudes and what they're trying to promote, what they don't like. And throughout Chan history, there have been many controversies of one teacher arguing with another. So he cites a passage from Zheng Mi about maintaining the correct mind at the last moment of death. This is a very important thing. And so Zheng Mi, now we're back in the Tang dynasty, right? We've been skipping dynasties. He said, when people are aware of the purpose of what they're doing, this is known as awakened mind. When they are not aware of the purpose of what they are doing, this is called scattered mind. People with scattered minds are driven by their emotions and will be led by their karma when they die. On the contrary, people with awakened minds will not be driven by their emotions and can change their karma when they die. And the one comment I want to make about this is it's very funny that Han Yu really didn't like Zheng Mi's teachings and thought that Zheng Mi was teaching losing Chan. I don't know if that's a familiar term to anyone, but once again, I think Zheng Mi was one of the great masters who was a real syncretist. He combined teachings of Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism and was really trying to bring people together. And so let me just skip a little bit. So Han Yu provides for Chan masters to how they should cite passages from the sutras when they teach Chan. And he says, when you cite sutra teachings to explain Chan practice, you must first eliminate emotion and reasoning so that you are without attachment. And I think that's quite interesting. I know I'm trying to do this at this moment. I'm trying to be as clear-headed and as unemotional, and I'm just trying to speak things as they occur to me. But one could see how if you have some axe to grind, you could really be trying to persuade people, not for their benefit, but for your benefit. So you must eliminate emotion and reasoning so that you are without attachment. Now, however, some intellectuals think they can penetrate Chan simply by explaining and speculating. Isn't this ridiculous? To Han Yu, a Chan master should not cite sutra teachings to explain Chan practice like lecture masters. Sutra teachings could be used to supplement Chan practice only when the Chan master has eliminated his or her emotion and reasoning and has no attachment. This is why Han Yu insisted on teaching the Zhezheng Zhuan right up to the last year of his life. And he also made one interesting remark about Zheng Mi. I think I'll stop this section with that. He said, Zheng Mi was teaching ultimate Chan, and you have to realize that ultimate Chan is not ultimate Chan. So just want to, that's a real Chan conundrum. So now, I think just in case people's minds have glazed over, I'm going to sort of change the intellectual tenor of the talk and go to a different mode of teaching, if you will. This is you can think of this as a commercial break. Let me, and of course our sponsor is the Buddha, right? And I'm just scrolling up here. Okay. So let me go to share again. Okay, so now what I have to do is shrink the screen. So everybody can see it now, right? Okay. So here we have a statue of the Buddha in the Earth Witness Mudra. And, you know, many of us look at statues quite a bit, and they can be a source of inspiration, right? A source of direction. But they are also a source of teaching, right? There's a lot going on here. I think many of you know the story, but just to give it very quickly, the Buddha, when he sat for 49 days under the Bodhi tree and was just about to reach enlightenment, Mara, the evil one, the disruptor, tried to stop him in many different ways. He sent his armies towards the Buddha, which didn't work because the Buddha raised his right hand and all the arrows turned to flowers. And Mara sent his daughters to try to seduce the Buddha, and that didn't work. And Mara tried to reason with the Buddha and said, what are you doing sitting under a tree? What kind of a king are you going to be, right? And that didn't work. And finally, Mara said, what right do you have to be a Buddha? I mean, who do you think you are? And the Buddha didn't say anything. He was sitting in meditation like that. And he took his right hand and touched the earth. And the earth goddess, Praviti, rose up and bowed to the Buddha and said to Mara, yes, this is the Buddha. He has accomplished everything in wisdom and compassion. Everything that had to be done has been accomplished, and he is the true and rightful Buddha. And Mara and his minions went screaming, running away. But let's look a little bit further into what this might mean. So the Buddha was meditating. So I look at his left hand, right, as being in the realm of wisdom, of the absolute, of Jur, right? And I look at his right hand as being in the absolute, in the realm of Zheng. Now this is I'm twisting things a little. I imagine there are words that might be a little bit better suited to this, but I think the underlying idea is sound, that the Buddha was touching the earth, and that event didn't just happen 2,500 years ago. That event has been happening all along and is happening right now. There is this connection. And so there's this connection with us studying and practicing what the Buddha taught in his touching of the ground. And it also means that we all have the right to be here and that we're all connected. It's really a very profound symbol, and it cuts through what I was just doing and talking about these masters from the Ming and the Sung and their disputes and whether they use sutras or not. This, you know, it gets very complicated or whatever, but this strikes right at the heart of what the Buddha was doing. It shows his accomplishment in the moment. And it's, once again, it's a statue, but what it's representing and embodying is certainly not a statue. We can really look beyond it and see it in another way. Now, by the same token, I want to show, this is a Tara, right? And I guess I have to shrink the screen a little. So get her head and her body in. Now, this is a kind of different set of mudras, all you know, all part and parcel of the teaching, all part of our practice in many ways. she has her left hand up in the abaya symbol of no fear, and also holding the lotus, showing that fear. This is my interpretation. Fear can be transformed into wisdom, and then her right hand is generosity. And what is she giving us? Well, no fear, the teachings, and all of us together. We give ourselves to ourselves, right? To everyone around. Now, the other thing that's interesting is the position of her legs. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a docent in a museum, and I give tours and show these statues often. And we have instructions about what to say about these things. And you can spin things out of your mouth without really knowing what you're talking about. This is very easy to do. So the first thing that we say is that, well, this is the technical name for the position that her legs are in. It's called royal ease, right? And it shows that she's ready to get up at any given moment, right? And metaphors, I've told this story many times, but I never tire of it, of when I gave a tour of second graders, and I was showing a statue of, happened to be Bengze Chen, another Dharma protector. And the little kid looked up at me and said, "Where's Bengze Chen? Right now, where is it? Where, like, what, right now, right at this moment, where is Tara or Avalokiteshvar? Are these just, are they characters in short stories or novels, right? Are they paintings on the wall? I mean, really, we look at these things and we don't think, don't take it to the next step. So there is that kind of intellectual understanding. But there's another way I realized that you could look at the way her leg is. Once again, you could look at her left leg as being in the practice of meditation, but her right leg is not constrained by any form. Her right leg is outside of conventions. It's partially in meditation, partially out. And I think that represents the absolute freedom of true enlightenment, that there's no constraints on our minds. Doesn't mean, of course, that we can fly or walk through walls, but it means that we can be creative in any given moment about what we're handed, and that we don't have to recoil emotionally from situations that we're in. That's the practice. So it's also a very beautiful statue. And so that was our break. And now we return to regular programming. So now I have to scroll down. And the next part of my talk is kind of a contemplation on practice and sutra study. And let's see how far I get with this. And once again, let me explain why I'm doing this. It's really, in a sense, a kind of contemplation, because one thing I've learned from studying the awakening of faith is that we are subject to habituation. We get into habits, and anything can be a habit, right? Not just eating a lot of donuts, but practice can be a habit. You can sit every day and just do it kind of mindlessly. You can chant mindlessly, out of habit. So to really be free in every moment, and actually that's one other thing I wanted to add about Tara's position. One of the things that really seems to represent to me is readiness. And this is a really important aspect of our practice, that you are in the moment, ready to deal with it at any moment, not having your mind wander and being somewhere else. Now, I have not personally achieved that, but that's my path someday. So So I just want you to know that's behind this kind of analysis of what's practice, what's sutra study, to really look at what we're doing. So when I say practice, I'm talking about practicing awareness, whether it's vipassana or samatha, counting breaths, chanting Buddha's name, working on a wato or silent illumination. Of course, reading a sutra could be practicing awareness, and practice itself sometimes yields dharmic insight. So right from the beginning, it's hard to, when we use definitions, to say it's only this, it's only that. But, you know, for the sake of argument and to look into that, we're going to pursue that for a little while. But there are two extremes. I sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier. There's someone who just reads sutras and articles and has a slew of opinions, some of which might be quite correct, but their intellectual understanding is not integrated into their daily life. They're still caught in daily afflictions, and they aren't motivated to move beyond them. That's one extreme. A second extreme is someone who just practices some form of meditation, sitting, walking, chanting, or even sutra recitation. They're mostly concerned with the effects of the meditation, calming perhaps, some insights here and there, but they're still stuck in their feelings and believe they're doing quite well and are on the path. And, you know, meditation can be sort of like a drug for some people. You can just be caught up in it, right? So it's something to think about. One key in maintaining our practice is sincerity and honesty and integrity. And I'm going to make a little digression of something I read just recently about emptiness. Well, I'm not going to go talking about emptiness, another big topic, but I did come across an article by Tanasiro Bhikkhu about emptiness from a Pali point of view. And he uses a visualization or a metaphor, if you will, of imagining you're in a monastery that used to be a palace. So you're aware of everything that's not there, all of the dancers and the singing and the food and whatever. So it's just an interesting sidelight. I'm just throwing that in as an Easter egg, if you will. But one thing that really hit me from his discussion, he said one thing about emptiness that's very important is it allows us to be honest. You know, we have this sense in English, I don't know if Chinese use this word, of being transparent, you know, not holding anything back, not hiding. So I think that's a really important factor to calculate into the way we practice. Another way of looking, you know, we're going practice, study, practice, to look at study as it's what involves the mind, using the mind to do mind stuff for the sake of having a mind kind of experience, and practice not doing that, but having a different kind of experience. Once again, this is the lines are not so clearly drawn. So you can have meditation practice, which is a body-based practice, applying the mind. The mind is accompanying the body, so to speak, as you go into yoga asanas, or you're lying down, standing up, or walking. This is really applying the body in a meditative mode, right? But under the guidance of the mind. No text is being studied. There's actually no experience other than what the body is doing, which is the subject of the meditation. Now that ties into what the Ming masters and Sung masters were worrying about. They were really looking into what we're really doing when we practice. So there are other kinds of practices, of course, like bowing or making offerings. You could take extended pilgrimages, go to multiple shrines. But study is about focusing the mind in a way that is not directly relevant to the body, at least initially, right? So that's one of the things that you could study about practice. So it gets us into a little convoluted way of sort of mixing these things up. So let's go to a simpler example. Let's say you've chanted a text and now you're going to study it. As you study it, what does your mind do? It opens up to the meanings. It looks at the rhythms. It translates the vocabulary. And I think this is a lot of what the Lotus Sutra is saying when it talks about the 5 practices. So I want to look a little more deeply into what that might mean. It examines the syntax. You know, you're seeing how words are put together, how they might relate to or not relate to others. You're closely working with language. This is all work of the mind. So where's the body when all this is happening? Well, your eyes are doing something, right? They're reading. Your body's there. You have to be sitting in some position. The brain part of your body is certainly engaged. But the real focus of study is not only on using the mind, but adapting the mind to whatever that subject is. And that is key. We don't just have to be absorbing cognitive information. And once again, I think that that was a concern of some of the masters we were talking about. So we could look at something. Let's imagine you're looking at a stupa. It's just a physical entity, right? But then someone might say to you, or you might read that the stupa is really a representation of the universe or of the Buddha's mind, or it's the coming together of the 5 elements. And you could get caught up in that without really being aware of how you are experiencing the stupa visually. So when people come to a retreat, what do we say to them? Even a short retreat, we say, don't read anything. Stop reading. Put your cell phone away. Don't be reading your text. Don't read a sutra. If you're going in the hall, we may do some chanting. You have a chant sheet. All you're going to do is replicate verbally the symbols that are on the sheet. This is taking people away from mind involvement and mental fabrication. And what would happen if we didn't do that? We'd be re-engaging the mind as a cognition factory. And mind, pure mind, is way beyond, above and below that. So mind, you know, the mind that is the Buddha is not only our thinking mind. We'd be in real trouble if that was the extent of our mind. So we might say that practice is always body focused, another way of looking at it, and study is always mind focused. This could be, if you look at, you know, we're examining these things, not making any kind of absolute statements. This could be a valuable distinction. Study is asking us to correlate ideas. Practice is asking us not to correlate. That's an oversimplification, to be sure, but it's worth some contemplation to see the usefulness of the distinction. Ultimately, we would not be making these kind of distinctions, but at various points in our journey, it's good to see what we're actually doing as opposed to what we think we're doing or we'd like to think we're doing. So it seems like we either have the experience of correlating ideas, which is the experience of studying. When we have the experience of not correlating ideas, we have the experience of practice. So things are not obviously as cut and dried as this. There can certainly be some confusion in the early years of practice. And I personally can't say I'm totally over this tendency because I can be meditating and feel that I'm in a pleasant state. And then it's not a big leap to say, oh, that's good. So I label it. And because it's good, I want more of it, right? And if it feels not pleasant, I don't want that. You know, and this can be very, very subtle, you know, almost below our awareness, you know, especially in the early years and in the later years of practice that, you know, we see subtler and subtler parts of our mind. So, you know, and the irony of that is that we're not trying to get caught up in labeling and attraction or repulsion. So the less aware we are, the more easily this kind of pattern behavior can slip in unconsciously. So let's see, I'm going to, I think I've kind of set out this issue, if you will, before. So studying and practice, we can look at it in many different ways. We can misunderstand like when Dogen Zenji said, think non-thinking, it sounds like a contradiction in terms. And all it really means is go ahead and think, but don't get attached to it. Recognize that your thoughts should be in service of the Dharma. I guess that then when your thoughts, I mean, I'm assuming, not that I understood Shifu's mind at all, but he wrote over 100 books and he had to do quite a bit of thinking, but that thinking was not for his benefit. He wasn't trying to get famous or anything. He was trying to spread the Dharma. So this thinking, so I think this is a really important point to make. Sometimes you'll see a teacher and they'll say, no, wipe out all thoughts in your mind. I mean, we don't say that at all, right? But people do say that. And you can still fall into that if you get frustrated with your practice and you say, oh, I'm thinking again. Oh, I'm thinking again. Oh, I just got distracted. I got distracted. I just don't want that to happen at all, right? Which is not the way to deal with that kind of situation. It's to recognize the affliction that comes up and your reaction to the affliction. You can certainly not generate thoughts and the reaction to thoughts if you maintain the proper kind of awareness. But it's very easy to get distracted. So one of the things I thought that I would do, and I think I can close with this in about 5 minutes, and I just thought it'd be an interesting thing to cap the talk over, right? So I spoke about the words and practice and study and gave examples both visually and doctrinally, from the real concerns of these Chan masters in the past. But I want to just work on something right from the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. And I want to just show how we're really talking and practicing about one thing, the one Dharma, right? And we have to recognize that as we progress, we're sort of on different sides of it until that day when we embody it. So in the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, the Buddha is talking about the different stages in his practice. And I think we can look at that as like the different stages in our practice. And I think almost anybody who's been practicing for a long time will have many experiences where you read something from a particular sutra. Either it makes no sense or it makes one kind of a sense. So just working with real life here. But then you come back and you keep looking at it differently. So I just think this is something to keep in mind. Let's see. So the Sutra of okay, all right. Sutra of Innumerable Meanings talks about how the teaching may seem different from the way the Buddha originally gave it, the way that he changed it for bodhisattvas, and then how he's introducing it now in the Lotus Sutra as the one vehicle, the one mind in my interpretation. And so let's see. I'm just looking. At the words. Okay. So everything okay? Okay. So this is a phrase the Buddha uses, which he says is apropos in every part of his teachings, which is inherently all things are tranquil and empty. constantly regenerating and never abiding, and produced and extinguished in every moment. So I want to use that as the thread to go through something I'm very famous about. Actually, it was Chan Master Sheng Yen Wei Shin said, you know, when I first started to study Buddha Dharma, I saw mountains and rivers. Later on, after meeting a Kalyana Mitra, I looked at mountain. There were no mountains and there were no rivers. And then later on, I saw them. So the mountains and rivers didn't change. The flow of the world didn't change. What was changing was his perception. So in the first period, mountains are mountains. So we realize that causes and conditions are very much intact, right? Mountains had a cause, the forming of the Earth's crust and all sorts of tectonic activity, right? And various chemical things happen in the atmosphere so that there were rivers. And so the water can stream down the mountain. But it seems like everything had causes and conditions. Everything's connected in a certain way. But then you look a little bit more closely and you say, well, wait a second. The causes and conditions are much more complicated than I thought. And I can't really follow them. And they're all interconnected. You can't tell what became before or after. And I realized that I have been living in my perception of the world as opposed to the world. So all of a sudden, there's this kind of disorientation, no longer mountains and rivers. But then in this last period, when everything becomes intact, you see that everything is different yet undifferentiated. So now you see whatever you see transparently, as I was talking about, with having the experience of emptiness. So that to me is a really good metaphor for understanding what's sort of the thread through my whole talk, sort of what oriented me, right? Because I finished the Lotus Sutra and I was wondering what the next step was. And so I was really interested in knowing how effective this is. How does someone use the teaching? Is it just a book that lies on someone's shelf, or is it sort of a living document that is explaining the world, if you will, helping people practice moving through the world and being of benefit to us and everybody we know? So once again, I talked about the difficulties of language. I talked about the great masters from the past and how they struggled with it because they're trying to teach as correctly as they can. I'm certainly nowhere near that level, but I'm trying to teach as correctly as I can. And when I give that last metaphor about the mountains and the rivers, it's not to give someone an impression that this is really beyond you, but it's really to show that all of the teachings are right here in front of you, and that we are directly connected to the Buddha. The Buddha is directly connected to us. And of course, it's often said, the Buddha sees us all as Buddhas. As it says in the Platform Sutra, when we're on the method, we're Buddhas, and when we're not, we're sort of ordinary sentient beings. And so I just want to close with something that Shi Chang Yen said, the founder of Tzu in her wonderful book about the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. She said that what we all are, we're walking sutras. And so think about it. We read the sutras, we read ourselves, we read other people, but we do it with a sense of love and compassion. I read recently, actually just one last quote from someone named Bill Lee. She said, if you want peace, be still. If you want wisdom, be silent. And if you want love, be yourself. And to translate that into Buddhist terms a little bit more, it's the last one is if you want to be compassion, and if you want to receive it and to generate compassion, be yourself, be who you really are. So, thank you. Oh, so questions from Zoom land, from in here.
Do you have anyone who have questions? The people online, that you can also just use the raise hand button.
Any kind of question, Dharma questions? If you want to know a good recipe for mac and cheese, we have someone here who can help. Makes good mac and cheese? Okay. All right. Oh, echo. I don't know if you're muted. Well, I can see everybody.
Hi, Harry.
Oh, hey, how you doing?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Earlier you talked about when you study sutra, you have to somehow emotions. Can you read that again? Can you say that again?
Well, the quote was from memory. This was I had a lot of Cha masters, and I think this was from Han Yue. The idea is when you teach sutras to students, you have to be clear about your emotional state, so that you're not you're conveying the teachings to the student. You're not conveying your distress or your particular opinions. You're trying to really be one with what the students' needs are. So you minister to them as well as you possibly can. That was I don't know if that got garbled up, but thanks for asking.
No, you also said that people, when they read the sutra, somehow has to do with emotions to understand.
Well, yeah, what I think is just in getting this distinction in terms of studying and reading the sutra. Mm-hmm. What I was going into, and of course I had a lot more detail I could have gone into, is what you think you're doing when you're doing it, what's your intention. Intention is so important in Buddhism. And if you're reading sutra or listening to a Dharma talk, and I've certainly been there, where you read something and you say, wow, that is really interesting. If I repeat that to somebody, they're going to think I'm really smart. So if you have that kind of attitude, it can be a problem. So you're really trying to be clear. And if you have those kind of attachments, that's what you might want to be looking at reading when you're practicing. Did I make myself clear? Was that?
Yes, that's very clear.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob.
Hey, Harry, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, because I'm on my iPhone. It gets a little screwy sometimes. Can you repeat that quote, or what you said about the palace and emptiness?
Oh, the quote. All right. So this was Thanissaro Bhikkhu, and he has an essay in Access to Insight. on emptiness, and it's actually three ways of approaching emptiness. But I happen to think that this was such a great thing because emptiness, you know, how many times have we heard about emptiness? And it's just, you know, it's just our eyes gloss over. But he said the idea is you imagine you're in a monastery. This monastery has been transformed. It used to be this incredible palace with gold and silver and jewels everywhere. And there were people in fine dress and musicians and elephants and horses putting on all sorts of display for royalty. But now it's been transformed into this monastery. So the instruction was kind of be aware of what might have been, what was. And I guess I just have that little snippet. It's not like it might not, it could turn into a palace again, you know, things change. So what I liked about that is it kind of sort of makes me think of what the Heart Sutra says. Form is emptiness, emptiness is not form. The forms are not there, but they were there, so they kind of could be there. You know, there's this whole potential, and it just was a way of looking at a situation and seeing it for what it was and what it is now, and seeing the dynamic in it. Anyway, it was just a kind of throwaway thing. I hope it's useful.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out. So like the emptiness is that because it could have been anything and it was something. It
That's
constantly...
my interpretation. I read this. If you go to Access to an Insight and you type in the word emptiness, you'll see Thanissaro Bhikkhu's essay on that. It's really very good.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Is it American cheese? Is that the secret?
For mac and cheese? Well,
Yeah, was it like, or Swiss?
I don't know.
Never mind.
Sorry. I don't know. What kind of cheese do you like?
No preferences. There's no like this
All right,
one.
look, we have a vote here for American cheese.
Thank you.